From 1861 to 1865, the United States of America fought in its now infamous Civil War. This was a war that pitted the Northern Union of states against the Southern states, which were attempting to gain their own independence as a confederacy. While a multitude of factors went into the start of this war, the main fighting point revolved around slavery and the abolishment of this awful system, which has plagued human cultures for millennia. The Southern Confederacy wanted to keep using slaves, while the Northern Union fought for the freedom of these people. This was a huge, violent war, brimming with bloodshed, resulting in well over 600,000 American casualties. For context, just over 400,000 Americans died during the Second World War. Also for context, the Civil War happened while the United Kingdom was in the middle of its Victorian era. I always find this fascinating. It has nothing to do with the rest of this video, but I just think it's crazy that the whole Victorian thing was going on while across the Atlantic a huge civil war was playing out. We often view historical events like this in a vacuum and not look into what was happening in the wider world at the time. Like for example, Charles Dickens had written most of his major works before the Civil War even started. But that's a huge tangent. What we need to know for this video is that the Civil War saw the United States divided in pretty much every possible aspect, from the country itself divided into two, to a huge divide in beliefs on both sides of the country. The country was also divided in another way, as something else the USA couldn't agree on during the midst of the Civil War were the names that should be used during this conflict. Names are a really interesting thing about war. There's often debate and divide about what a war or a battle should really be called, and normally titles are only agreed upon way after the fact. We've looked into how wars get named before, and this very video started life as a broader overview of battle names, but instead I decided to focus on this specific war and its names. Though if you want to see a wider video about war and battle names, do let me know down below. While this war today is now pretty much universally referred to as the Civil War, or the American Civil War for those of us outside the US, this name wasn't really used during the time it was being waged. In fact, there really wasn't one single dominant name for the war, as both sides referred to it by different names. In the North, it became known as the Great Rebellion, or even the War of the Rebellion, while in the South it was being referred to as the War for Southern Independence. It's these titles we have records of being used during the fighting of this war, and what's interesting about them is the fact they highlight the biases of either side, and what either side thought this war was all about. The Union in the North felt like the South was betraying them, trying to gain their own power. This led to them seeing it as a rebellion against their authority, hence why both their names for this war referred to it as a rebellion. The South meanwhile viewed this war as their chance of freedom and independence, hence why independence is such a strong feature for their names for this war. But while these names are different to one another, they do both also kind of have the exact same meaning. Both names imply that one part of the nation is attempting to leave the other and do its own thing. One person's rebellion is another person's war for independence, I suppose. Like I said, these names reflect the biases of either side, and it's only after the fact that a name which removes all biases came to the forefront. But even then, that title of Civil War is still debated by some. Don't worry, we'll get to it. Yet, these are not the only names the Civil War was known as during the time, as there's also a collection of other names it was going under too. Another notable name was the Slaveholders' Rebellion. This name for the events was prominently used by Frederick Douglass, a man born into slavery who escaped in his youth. Douglass went on to become a prominent writer and figure in the African American civil rights movement. I'm giving a brief overview of this guy here because I get the impression that while he is a well-known figure in the US, outside his story isn't as reported on. Like I'm not entirely sure how commonly known of he is here in the UK, for example. But with this context, it makes sense why he and many others would refer to this war as the Slaveholders' Rebellion. Slavery was at the heart of this war, and to Douglass and many others, that was the key thing they were fighting over, as opposed to say Southern independence or anything like that. To Douglass, this was a war initiated by slaveholders, rebelling against the idea of emancipation, so it makes sense why he would call it the Slaveholders' Rebellion. Other names this war went under historically include the likes of the War of Separation or the War of Succession. It was also referred to in the South as the War of Northern Aggression during the time of Jim Crow laws in the mid-20th century. This name helped shape the idea in the South that the war was brought on by an enraged North. Once again, it helps cement biases. Other, less prominent names the war went under include ones such as the Confederate War, Mr. Lincoln's War, the euphemistic name of the recent unpleasantries. Karl Marx, who was around at this time, simply referred to it as the American Anti-Slavery War, another title which also puts a huge emphasis on the slavery which both sides were fighting over. What all of this shows us is that in the midst of this war, either side really couldn't agree on anything, including the names of the war, which also implies heavily what the war was even all about. The thing is, it wasn't just the name of the war itself that both sides were unable to agree on. Even the names of individual battles were different on either side. As mentioned earlier, this entire video was going to be about battles in general, and the conventions of naming battles. Both sides of this war decided to use completely different naming conventions when it came to the titles of their fights. The Northern Union decided to name battles after nearby geographical features to the fights, like rivers and such, while the Southern Confederacy decided to name them after nearby towns and settlements. For example, the first major battle of the Civil War was dubbed the First Battle of Bull Run by the North, in reference to the Bull Run River, while the South called it the Battle of First Manassas, in reference to the city of Manassas in Virginia. Other examples include the Battle of Beaver Dam Creek being called the Battle of Mechanicsville in the South, and the Battle of Stones River being called the Battle of Murfreesboro in the South too. What's interesting is that unlike the name for the war itself, singular names haven't been all that agreed upon for these battles. Most sources will still highlight both names for them. The leading theory as to why the North chose to name battles after geography and the South after settlements seems to be in relation to their familiarity with the land, or lack thereof I ought to say. At the time, the North was far more urbanized and dotted with plenty of towns and cities. These kinds of settlements weren't all that remarkable to them. What Northern soldiers were much more taken aback by was the dramatic nature which dotted parts of the country they were unfamiliar with. These mighty rivers and landscapes stuck way more in their mind, so they named battles after them. And it's pretty much the opposite that happened in the South. Most Southern soldiers were very familiar with the USA's natural beauty and weren't all that taken aback by it. What stuck in their mind better were the settlements they came across, as once again towns and cities weren't as commonplace in the South. So they named the battles after these settlements, which stuck in their brains. This convention of the Union and the Confederacy naming after either geography or settlements even got applied to their armies too. Northern armies were named after geography, such as the Army of the Gulf, the Army of the Potomac, or the Army of the Cumberland, while Southern armies were named after settlements, such as the Army of Northern Virginia, or the Army of Central Kentucky. This could make things somewhat confusing at times, as many settlements are named after geographical features, so there was some overlap in their names. Perhaps the most confusing being the Northern Army, named the Army of the Tennessee, named after the Tennessee River, and the Southern Army of Tennessee, named after the state of Tennessee. Suffice to say, all these different names for the exact same event could make things rather confusing. But when this war eventually came to an end, with Northern victory and the emancipation of slaves, it meant the fighting was officially resigned to the history books. And it's within the context of history that names for wars and battles often get cemented. And of course, as the old saying goes, history is written by the winners. It took some time for a singular name to be decided upon. In the following decades, a mixture of those aforementioned names were used by various pockets of the United States. There is actually evidence of it being referred to as a civil war during the time. Confederate General Robert E. Lee even wrote to his family near the start of the war saying that, as far as I can judge by the papers, we are between a state of anarchy and civil war. But it was only in the early 20th century that a name got cemented, after enough time had passed and reconciliation between both sides could properly commence. From my hypothesizing, this name of Civil War became the go-to name for a fairly simple reason. Unlike previous titles, it's fairly unbiased. The name doesn't hint towards one side seeking independence or another side quelling a rebellion. It's a simple statement of the facts. A civil war is the go-to title for a war fought within a country itself, and that's exactly what happened here. And while it's the most popular name for the events, as I hinted towards, there are still people who disagree with this name, especially those in states which made up the Confederacy. Some argue that this wasn't a civil war, as it wasn't fought between two sides from the same country, but instead a war between two separate nations, as the Confederacy was striving for independence. This has led to another name for the Civil War, which many still insist on referring to it as the War Between States. This name is heavily linked with the South to this day, and a concept referred to as the Lost Cause. The Lost Cause is this distorted idea that the South were fighting for their own way of life, which was taken by the North, and pushes back on the idea that the real driving force of this war was the South's desire to maintain the use of slavery, which, isn't a good thing. The Lost Cause today is widely seen as non-factual and is disregarded by most academic sources, but it has maintained a stronghold in parts of the South and has kept alive for many a sense of false nostalgia for a South now lost to time. While we have that name of the War Between States used by small pockets of people who yearn for a time when slavery was legal, as that is ultimately what the Lost Cause stands for and why it's discredited by most, it's that title of Civil War which is maintained as the dominant title for this conflict, despite all the confusion surrounding the names of battles, armies and the war that came before it. And while it's easy for someone like myself, a Brit who lives on the other side of the planet, to make a silly little YouTube video on the subject, it cannot be underestimated what a huge impact these names have had on the US and the cultural resonance they have to this day. The USA is a huge nation, potted with natural beauty and small towns. Before the war, most of the features that became the namesakes of these battles weren't really places of interest. But due to the bloodshed and deaths which occurred in these places, their names have been cemented in the collective American psyche as names linked to tragedy and violence. This is perhaps best summed up in the poem Names from the War, written by Bruce Catton to commemorate the centenary of the American Civil War. And I'm going to wrap up this video with an abridged version of said poem. Once the land had no great names and no history. It was a good land, with wood lots holding shadows beside the hot fields, Bine hills hazy on the horizon, country roads going in aimless meanders from creek bottom and country store to places of no particular importance. They put names on towns and crossroads and rivers, borrowing harsh words the Indians had left behind, using homespun words of their own, naming the land so they could know it. The names had no ring or shine to them then. They were just names, put there so that a man could say where he was. Then the armies came and the names became terrible. The armies trampled the lazy roads to ruin, raising endless dust clouds for a pillar of smoke day by day, lighting thousands of campfires for a pillar of fire by night. Tiny fires that glowed on lonely bivouacs, just this side of nowhere. By the campfires, boys looked into the night to the home places they might not see again, not looking ahead because of what they might see tomorrow, writing letters to the folks to say where they were. And the postmarks on the letters carried the names that had grown menacing and evil, names that would echo in American life forever afterward, telling of fire on farm and hilltop, speaking of the thousands who found the end of the road in some obscure place they had never heard of. Those strange country names from the war, Sharpsburg and Spotsylvania, Pittsburgh Landing and Bryce's Crossroads, Chickamauga and Games Mill, Milliken's Bend, Ulster, Bentonville, Gettysburg, Corinth, Manassas, Cross Keys, Mechanicsville, Chattanooga, Franklin, La Scala, Dover. Quiet names of doom, stamped on soiled envelopes, going across all of America, weaving a crimson thread into the nation's memory. Names that many families would never dare say again, not until years and the growth of quiet pride had done their work. Name Explained depends on viewers like yourself supporting the channel financially on Patreon, so a huge thank you to everyone who does. Donating just $1 a month helps the channel amazingly and gets you bonuses including ad-free videos, exclusive content, the power to request ideas to be made into actual Name Explained videos, and your name at the end of the video with all these awesome people. Visit patreon.com/NameExplain or click the link down below to find out how you too can support the channel. Thank you. thanks for reaching the end of the video. Why not watch another and subscribe to keep up to date on all things Name Explain. You can find myself on Instagram where I'm NameExplainYT, and join the Facebook group Friends of Name Explain to talk with myself and other name nerds. All that will be linked down below. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and once again, thank you all so much.